Welcome back, everyone. Today we're gonna be making a hoodie neck warmer. And this is not just your standard hoodie neck warmer. It's gonna have a top and also buckles that go under your arms so it secures it down tightly, allowing you to throw it on under your jacket or your sweater, and it's not gonna move around. And this is a great project for all skill levels. I'm gonna be running you through the fabrics, the machines, everything you need to know so you can complete this project and make it look professional. But other than that, if you're new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna need to grab 1 to 1 1/4 yards for your main fabric. And I recommend using a Sherpa, a fleece, or a sweatshirt fleece. These fabrics are super easy to work with. They have a little bit of stretch to them, and they're also gonna keep you warm. I'm actually gonna be using 2 different fabrics. I'm gonna be using a Sherpa and a sweatshirt fleece. But like always, get creative with it, use different fabrics, find something that's really gonna make your design pop. You'll need 2 eyelets, and you can pretty much use any size eyelet. I'm gonna be using a 5/16. It's a little bit bigger. Eyelets come in different kits, different sizes, different finishes. They also come with the hardware needed to install them. So if you're not familiar with eyelets, I definitely recommend looking at one of these kits. It makes it super easy to use them, and it's a great place to start out. You'll need 1 yard of cord, and this can pretty much be any type of cord. I'm gonna be using a paracord. I found this is super durable, easy to work with, and overall looks really nice. But feel free to use any type of lace, drawstring, cord, because all you needed to do is fit through your eyelet and go around your hood. And if it can do that, you can totally use it. Going along with the cord, you'll need 2 cord stoppers. These come in all different shapes and sizes. I'm gonna be using a kit that comes with a bunch of different styles. It's a great way to go if you're not sure which one to use because you can try and test different ones to see what's gonna look best with your design. But this is also optional, so if you don't wanna use cord stoppers, you don't have to. You'll need 1 1/4 yard of 1-inch webbing, and this varies based on how big you wanna make the under strap. If you wanna leave a lot of room to really cinch it tight, you might wanna go a little bit more than 1 1/4 yards, but I found that to be a pretty sweet spot. It's a good place to start, and you can always trim it back if it's too much. Going along with that webbing, you'll need 2 1-inch buckles. You can pretty much get any style buckle. I'm gonna show you a few different options later on in the video, but as long as it's 1 inch and your webbing can fit through it and it's nice and tight, you should be good to go. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And after you gathered all your supplies, printed out your pattern, it's time to move into cutting.
And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer's alignment for the best possible results. From here, we're gonna cut on the outside of the black line. Once you cut out your panels, you should end up with 2 middle hood panels cut out of your main fabric, 1 neck warmer panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. And real quick before we move on, this pattern can be easily customized to different heights if you're looking for a taller neck warmer. You're gonna fold it in half at the center fold guide so you can see the height and what you're working with, and from here you can decide whether you wanna add on or even subtract. The taller you make it, the higher it's gonna rest on your face. Moving on, you're gonna need to cut 2 to 4 main hood panels out of your main fabric. I'm gonna be cutting 4, and I'm gonna be using 2 different fabrics. This is just to show you what you can do with this pattern. There's 2 ways you can make this hood. You can either use 2 panels or 4 panels, and we're gonna get more into this later on. You'll need 2 back panels cut out of your main fabric on the fold, and lastly 2 front chest panels cut out of your main fabric on the fold. Moving on to construction, we're going to start by grabbing our front chest panel and our back panel. Unfold both panels, remove 1 layer, place the right sides together, lining up both of the top shoulder edges. Repeat this process for the opposite 2 panels, and we're going to stitch the top shoulder edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And before we get started, for this project, we're going to be using a serger. Sergers are great for stretchy knit fabrics. They're going to allow the fabric to stretch and the thread not to break. They also cut and clean up the edges as you're sewing. I highly recommend using a serger for this project, but if you don't have one, it's totally fine. I'm going to show you another method for sewing stretchy knit on your domestic sewing machine. Switch your machine to a zigzag stitch with the higher width and stitch length, and by doing this, it will allow the thread to stretch with the fabric. And either method works great, so choose what works best for you. And I do highly recommend looking into a serger if you plan on sewing a lot of knit fabric. It really saves a lot of time and overall makes your projects look more professional. From here, we're going to grab one of our assemblies, open it up with right sides facing up. Before we stitch these two panels together, we're going to quickly add a top stitch to both of our new seams. So what I'm going to do is fold that seam allowance so it points towards the back panel and add my stitch. But before we do this, I'm going to run you through a few techniques on top stitching knit fabrics. Starting with the cover stitch machine, this is the machine that's used on mostly all knitwear products that you're going to buy in the store. It's a similar concept to the serger where the thread is going to stretch with the fabric so the thread doesn't snap. Most of these machines give you an option of 2 to 3 needles in a wide variety of stitch styles, and you use it the same way as a sewing machine. I ran it through directly on top of the seam so I have a stitch on both sides. You can do it this way or you can do it on one side of the seam, but as you can see, the back looks similar to a serge and it's going to have a nice cross stitch and it stretches without snapping the thread. To get it looking perfect, I do recommend using an edge presser foot and also matching your thread with the color of your fabric. The second option is using just a standard domestic sewing machine. I typically stick to just the straight stitch, but you can mix it up, add a twin needle, and get a similar effect as the cover stitch machine. The twin needle will give you 2 stitches and a zigzag back, so it will allow the thread to stretch with the fabric. For this project, I'm going to be using the straight stitch paired with the edge presser foot. The edge presser foot is going to help guide me along that seam and give me a nice straight stitch on top. After finishing up the top stitch, double check to make sure the seams are looking good and the edges are lined up. If everything checks out, make sure the chest panels are pointing towards you and we're going to place the right sides together. Adjust the panels so the outside edges are lining up, and from here we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. For this stitch I will be using a serger, but if you're not experienced with a serger, I recommend using just a zigzag or a straight stitch because going around these corners is tricky and you can clip the edges. So definitely keep this in mind if you are using a serger. After finishing up the serge, we're going to double check, make sure all the layers got stitched together. It's very easy to miss a layer, so it's a good habit just to check. From here, we're going to flip the right sides out, poke out all those corners as good as you can, lining up the outside edges. I do recommend placing a few pins for this next step along those edges when you have them lined up because we're going to be top stitching all the way around the outside edge. And keeping the top and bottom panel aligned as you're sewing can be pretty tricky. I will be using a straight stitch and the edge presser foot. The edge presser foot really works great for this step because you can line it up right on that edge and stitch all the way around, no problem. It also helps speed up the process because you're not taking a lot of time to line the stitch up as you're sewing, you're just kind of going off that guide. As you can see, this kind of tightened up that outside edge, giving it a cleaner finish. Top stitching is optional, so if you don't like the look, feel free to skip it. Place this panel off to the side and grab your 1-inch webbing. And when it comes to the style of webbing, feel free to use whatever webbing that's going to work best with your project. You're going to want to cut 2 20-inch strips and 2 5-inch strips. And the sizes of these strips can be adjusted for a different look, but we'll get more into that in a second. Lay out your back and chest assembly with the chest panel pointing towards you. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the webbing placement guides. Simply just line up the pattern with the edges of your panel and mark out the area using chalk. Repeat this for the opposite side of the front chest panel, and then we're going to flip it over and do the same thing for the back panel. As you can see, the back panel guide goes all the way through the pattern, but we're going to start by just marking the bottom areas. This is because there's a couple different ways you can lay the webbing on the back panel. You can lay it all the way to the top neck edge and have the webbing hang over that edge so it's easy to sew on. But the webbing I'm using is fairly thick and I don't want to add any more bulk to that neck edge, so I'm actually going to slide these down just a little bit so that way they're in the middle of that back panel. And by doing this, I'm going to roll over the webbing ends so you have a nice clean edge. This is just one of many ways to do this, but before we stitch the back ones on, we're going to flip it back to the front chest panel, grab our 2 5-inch strips of webbing. We will also need 2 buckles, and it doesn't matter what style buckle you use. You can use ones with 4 opening, or you can use ones with 3 openings. Either style buckle will do the same thing, so just use the buckles that work best with your project. If you are using the 3 opening buckles, you can start by feeding your 5-inch strip of webbing through the side with the 1 opening. If you're using the 4 opening, we're going to start at the top of the buckle and feed it through just the front opening. Next, we're going to feed the webbing out just enough so we can fold the opposite side over and have equal parts on both sides and the webbing ends meeting in the middle. From here, we're going to grab our chest assembly with the front chest panel pointing towards you, locate the areas you few marked with chalk, and we're going to place the webbing directly on top of those areas with the buckle hanging just over the edge. Grab your second buckle and repeat this on the opposite side of the pattern. And you mainly want to make sure you try to mirror the angle on the opposite side. Once your buckles are positioned, we're going to stitch around the outside edge as close as you can to the edge. This is another step the edge presser foot really comes in handy because you can get really close to that outside edge and make that stitch look really neat. These stitches will be highly exposed, so you want to try to make them look as neat as possible. And when it comes to the box stitch, you can do a box stitch, you can do an X stitch, you can do a couple stitches in the middle to really secure that webbing down and add a nice touch. From here, we're going to spin it around to the back panel side, grab your 20-inch webbing strips. And again, real quick before we sew these on, you can adjust these to a bigger size so you have more room to adjust it under your arms. So if you feel like 20 inches is not enough, just add a couple inches to both sides because you can always trim it down at the end. Place the webbing strips on the chalked out areas. And again, we're not going to have ours go all the way to that top neckline. We're going to bring them down to the center point of that back panel and roll over the ends for a clean finish. But before I stitch this down, I'm just going to be doing one quick thing. I'm going to be adding 1-inch D-rings to that rolled over section. This really doesn't serve a purpose, it's just for looks, and it just gives an idea of something you can do to really add on and customize this pattern. I love adding little details like this because it might spark something for you and a new fun feature you can add on yourself. With the webbing strips in place, we're going to stitch exactly the same way we did for the front chest panel. Stitch all the way around the outside edge as close as you can to that edge. The same goes for these webbing strips. Feel free to add more stitches throughout the middle of that webbing or add an X. You can even do a decorative stitch with a different color thread to make it look totally different. And with the back panel webbing sewn on, the next thing we would typically do is feed these ends through the opposite sides of our buckles. But we're going to save this step for later on because it kind of gets in the way, I noticed, as you're sewing. So from here, we're actually going to move towards the center neckline. And what we're doing in this step is actually sewing these layers together using the serger. It can be a little bit difficult sewing an inside curve with the serger, so what I am doing is pulling it as I'm going so I have a nice straight edge every time it lines up with that needle. Quickly check to make sure both of the layers got stitched together, and from here we're going to place this complete assembly off to the side. Next we're going to start assembling the hood, so grab your main hood and your middle hood panels, and you can make this hood as a single or double layer. Both ways it's going to be assembled the same, so start by finding the drawstring hemline on the middle hood panel. This is the edge that's going to line up with the front of our hood, and the front of our hood is the flat straight edge. So start by grabbing one of your middle panels, one of your hood panels, and lining it up on the back curved edge with the drawstring hemline edges meeting at the front of the hood. Place a few pins to keep the layers lined up. If you are only doing a single layer, you can stitch that edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but if you're doing a double layer hood, we're going to grab our opposite side of panels. When you're making the 2-layer hood, you're going to have an inside and an outside. In the outside, I'm using the Sherpa, so I'm going to grab the Sherpa section of panels and do the same thing, lining up the middle hood panel on the outside curved edge of the main hood panel. With the panels lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that curve. Again, if you are only making a 1-layer hood, you only have to do this for one panel, and you're only going to need one middle panel. And after stitching the middle hood panel onto the main hood panel back edge, we're going to work with one section at a time. So starting with our inside layer, we're going to grab the opposite side of our inside layer and place it on the opposite side of that middle hood panel, making sure our drawstring hemlines meet and the bottom lines up. Place a couple pins to secure the layers together, move it off to the side. I'm going to grab my outside layers and do the same exact thing. If you're not adding the second layer to the hood, you only have to do this for one side. Just like the other side, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sorry if it's getting confusing between the 1 and 2 layers. Essentially, we're doing the same thing twice for both the layers, so if you're only making the 1 layer, you only do it one time. After stitching, this is going to complete the actual structure of the hood. You can see that it's a basic hood shape with that middle section. I like that middle section because it adds a little bit of flatness to the top and rests on your head really nice. Before we move on to the next step, we're going to quickly add top stitching to that middle hood panel. I'm going to be folding the seam allowance towards the center of that middle hood panel, but feel free to go in either direction. I'm actually doing it this way because I don't want to stitch on the Sherpa. So folding it towards the center is going to work best for the fabrics I'm using. It's just another thing to keep in mind on what fabrics you choose to use. You can always switch it up and fold the seam allowance different directions to have it work with your fabrics. The top stitch is going to yield the same results whether you fold it towards the center or towards the outside, so just keep that in mind as you're sewing. In the end, adding these top stitches really gives the hood a nice, complete, professional finish. You can choose to skip these steps, but I highly recommend trying it at least one time. Before we add these two layers together to make the double layer hood, I quickly want to run you through what you do if you're using a single layer hood. So grab the pattern and we're going to use it as a guide to mark out our drawstring hemline and our eyelet guide. The eyelet can essentially be placed anywhere along that drawstring hemline. It really depends on how far you want it to hang down from the hood. I only recommend going up a couple inches from the bottom so you have enough room to sew it onto the neckline. So after adding the eyelet, what you're going to do is roll that drawstring hemline edge over, and you want that eyelet to be on the inside of that loop. So this is why you add the eyelet first, so that way you can roll it over under that eyelet and create that loop that you slide the drawstring through. And when it comes to the actual drawstring hemline, you can move this back if you want or forward. You can make it smaller, shorter, longer, whatever you want to do is totally customizable. Just make sure that eyelet's on the inside of the loop. Alright, moving back over to the double layer hood, we're actually not going to be using the eyelet guide or the drawstring hemline guide because we're going to be sewing these layers together, and we can add this as we go in the next steps. So to start, we're going to flip one of the panels inside out and slide the opposite panel inside that panel with right sides together, lining up the middle and main hood panels. And the easiest way to keep everything aligned is to line it up on that middle hood panel. This is going to keep both sides centered, and I highly recommend adding a couple pins so nothing shifts around as you're sewing. With both sides lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way along that front edge. This stitch is going to secure both of those layers together and essentially form your double layer hood. And a big way I like to do it this way is so that way you're not exposing any seams on the inside of your hood. So flip the right sides out, check to see if all the layers are stitched together. If everything's looking good, we're going to go ahead and start adding our eyelets to both sides, and we're only adding these eyelets to one layer, and this is going to be the outside layer. And realistically, the eyelet can be placed anywhere along that front edge of the hood. We'll be placing a stitch on the inside edge of the eyelet to create the loop. When it comes to figuring out the size of eyelets to use, just use what's going to work best with your project. I'm using a larger eyelet because I feel it works better with the Sherpa fabric I'm using. When you find where you want to place the eyelet, we're going to snip a little hole so that way we can feed the back of the eyelet through that hole. These specific eyelets come with a flat washer-like back. Place that backing on top of the eyelet, sandwiching the fabric in between. You also have a few different ways to install these. I'm going to be using a standard hammer die. This is by far the cheapest and easiest method. All you do is slide that hammer die on the back of the eyelet and hammer it into position. Super simple and looks really nice. You can get die presses and everything if you plan on making a lot of these, but if you're just making a few, no need to spend all the money, just use a hammer die and it still looks really nice. If you are using a thinner fabric, I highly recommend using an interface backing. With one of our eyelets locked down, we're going to do the same thing to the opposite side. Find it's easiest to line up the bottom edge and eyeball where to position the second eyelet. Sometimes going off the eye looks a lot nicer than actually trying to line up the pattern and get it perfect. And before we jump into adding our drawstring hem stitch, we're going to quickly top stitch that front edge. So what I'm going to do is fold that seam allowance towards the inside hood panel and stitch directly on top of the seam allowance. And I found this really helps separate both of these hood panel layers. Sometimes without a top stitch, it looks bunchy up front when you add the hem stitch. So this is a quick little technique that you can use to reduce a little bit of that bunchy. And I'm actually jumping that middle hood section. And the only reason I'm doing that is because I'm using a different color thread because I want the thread color to match. This step is optional, so feel free to skip it if you don't want to add this detail. Moving on, we're going to add our drawstring hemline stitch. This stitch is going to be on the outside edge of our eyelets, and you can do it anywhere on that outside edge. You can go really far out, but keep in mind you are making a loop for the drawstring, so that drawstring will wander. So I like to keep it as close to that eyelet as possible. And try to keep this stitch as even as possible along that front edge. Again, I'm jumping the middle section. This is only because I'm using a different color thread. If you're using all one color, you can go straight on through. Once you finished up the stitch, it is ready to put your drawstring in, but we're actually going to wait on this drawstring. It gets in the way as you're sewing it onto the actual main assembly. So place the drawstring off to the side, and since this is a double layer, what I recommend doing is serging that bottom edge. Make sure those layers are lined up evenly. I like to use the middle hood panel as the point of alignment. With the bottom edge perfectly lined up, we're going to add our serge. And if you don't have a serger, feel free to do a zigzag stitch. The goal is to sync those layers together so they're not moving around in later steps. Quickly check to make sure all the layers got stitched together, and that's going to complete your hood panel assembly. We can place this panel off to the side and grab your neck warmer panel. Unfold the panel so the right side is facing up. Fold it back in half with right sides together. Before we stitch the outside edge, I just want to show you really quick on the pattern where you can adjust it to make it taller or shorter. Adding or subtracting height to this pattern will adjust it, so if you want a taller neck warmer, you can add to this and it's going to go further up your face. Anyways, moving on, with the right sides together, we're going to stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And after finishing up stitching that edge, we're going to grab the pattern, and as you can see, there's a center fold guide. Referencing that guide, we're going to fold the pattern in half so the wrong sides are together. This will create a nice round edge at the top and raw edges on the bottom. Next, we're going to finish off that bottom edge by serging both of the layers together, but before we do that, I want to show you a quick feature you can add on if you want more control to that neck warmer. It's very similar to the hood panel. We're going to create a loop by adding eyelets and a stitch. Instead of drawstring, add elastic and a cord stopper. This will allow you to cinch that neck warmer up to your face, and I'm not going to do it for this video. If you want to go check that other video out, you can. It'll be the same exact steps, but for this one, we're just going to do a plain straight up neck warmer. After sealing off that bottom edge, we're going to grab our hood panel assembly. First thing we're going to want to do is place that seam in the center of the neck warmer and chalk out the center on the opposite side. Using these guides, we're going to line up that neck warmer along the bottom edge of our hood assembly. Place the neck warmer seam directly in the center of the hood panel. This will keep that seam behind you and out of the way. Next, we're going to wrap the side edges of the hood assembly towards the front center of the neck warmer assembly. If you did make yours as a single layer, you're going to lose a little bit of distance in that front edge, so it's not going to directly meet in the center. Same goes for the double layer. It should be just short of touching. In this step, we're simply just going to attach both of these layers together, so once you have it lined up, we're going to stitch that bottom edge all the way around directly on top of our other stitches. Stitching all these layers together can be pretty bulky, so take your time. And like always, after finishing up the stitch, make sure all those layers are locked together along that bottom edge. Place the new hood assembly to the side and grab your chest assembly. Mark the centers on both the chest and the back panel. Try to be as precise as possible. With those centers marked, we're going to place the hood on the inside with right sides together. Make sure the back of the hood is on the back panel and the front of the hood is on the front chest panel. If sewn correctly, both of those necklines should have the same circumference, so they'll line up nice and easy. Add a few pins to secure these layers together and stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As you can see, I'm using a straight stitch. This is way too many layers for my serger to handle. This could be done on an industrial serger, but a straight stitch works perfectly. And this is another reason why doing a single layer hood has an advantage. Flip the right sides out, find the neckline edge, and this next step is again optional. We're going to be top stitching all the way around that outside edge. I'm going to be folding that seam allowance away from the hood panel so it's on top of the chest and back panel and stitching directly on top of that seam allowance. Adding this top stitch can be pretty tricky because you want it to be as neat as possible on the outside edge because it's very visible. So if you choose to add it, just take your time, go slow, and it should turn out great. Just like all the top stitching, it really separates the hood from the bottom section and gives you that super clean professional look. It also flattens out that seam allowance on the inside for a more comfortable fit. Next, we're going to find the webbing ends that are connected to the back panel and we're going to feed them through the opposite side of the buckle. First feeding it through the inside opening and back down through the outside opening. Pull the webbing out a couple inches and we're going to roll the end over twice for a nice clean finish. With the end rolled over, we're going to add a tack stitch and repeat this process for the opposite strap. Depending on the webbing you're using, it can get pretty bulky, so just take your time as you're stitching. And feel free to add a couple more tack stitches for extra strength. With the webbing ends finished off, we're gonna move up to the hood and add our drawstring. And I'm just using standard paracord. I find it works really nice and lasts long. And a trick to feeding the drawstring through is using a safety pin or a paper clip. I didn't have a safety pin laying around. That's probably the best thing to use, but essentially you attach it to the end of your cord. And by doing this, it's gonna help you feed it through that drawstring loop. If you're just using the cord, you can't really feel it on the inside. By using the paper clip, you can feel that paper clip and you continue to move it all the way around to the opposite side. There are plenty ways of doing this. I just found this technique to be super quick and easy. Next, we're gonna figure out where we wanna cut the cord, and this is all personal preference. I recommend trying it on and just seeing how far the cord hangs down and cutting it where you like it best. We're gonna be adding cord stoppers to both sides. There's plenty of styles to choose from. I grabbed a kit with multiple options, so feel free to get creative with it. These are simply added by pressing the cord stopper button and feeding your cord through the cord stopper. To prevent the cord stopper from sliding off, the simplest way is to tie a knot. But if you're looking for something more custom, I recommend cutting out little leather strips and attaching them with double-sided rivets. And just like that, we're on the final step, and that's adding your branding. I also added double-sided rivets into the webbing on the front and the back. I found it just to be a cool little unique look. It's gonna add a little more strength, but overall, it's mostly for look. But the biggest thing to keep in mind with this pattern, it's very easy to customize the size of the hood, the actual width and height of the bottom base panel. You can make this longer, you can make it shorter, you can make it wider, and that's all gonna change the look overall. Because that's the fun thing about these patterns, you could use them as a foundation to make your own custom design.
And there you have it, your hoodie neck warmer is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully yours turned out as good as mine. I always love seeing what you come up with, so definitely tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. And sometimes it doesn't come together the first try, and it just takes practice to really perfect these steps and use these machines. Over time, you will see the change and the difference, and your stuff will start looking better. Just keep practicing and practicing. Each project, you're gonna pick up new skills. You can use those skills in your next project. And with time, you're gonna become really good at sewing and also designing, because each one of these patterns, I base them off of a foundational design, so you can use that and you can build on top of that. Whether it's adding pockets, changing the dimensions, it's really easy to do, and it's a great way to learn how to design. But other than that, thank you so much again for watching. I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.